The law of attraction. You've probably heard the phrase, you attract what you believe in. But is this actually true, specifically from the perspective of neuroscience? This is what we're going to discuss today. Hi, my name is Neda Wapteva. I have a bachelor's in psychology from the University of Birmingham and a master's in clinical neuropsychiatry from King's College London. My main interests in neuroscience include things like sleep, consciousness, dreams, hallucinations, predictive processing, meditation, and things like that. Which is precisely why I think a topic like this is extremely interesting for me to explore, because underneath all the metaphysically, pseudoscientifically sounding fluff, there is some truth behind it. There is a grain of truth behind it all. And specifically, I want to discuss how your brain and what you consciously or subconsciously believe shapes not just your beliefs and your behavior, but your literal perception of the world around you. And just to specify, I don't believe the law of attraction in a literal sense. I don't believe that thinking something or saying something gets embroidered into some metaphysical ether or realm that literally manifests things into reality. No, that's not what I'm talking about. However, there are people who practice this and report success in practicing this and would swear that their manifestations come true and their beliefs come true. So there are three ways in which people can experience their beliefs and thoughts manifesting. The first one, which I'm going to focus on, is the more neuroscience-based one, which is about how the brain shapes your perception. This is, to me personally, the most interesting one. The second reason is how the first part, the neuroscience part, can influence one's behavior, consciously or subconsciously. And the third reason is another psychological reason, which is to do with cherry picking. However, the first reason is going to take the main chunk of this explanation. Okay, so perception and attention are a fascinating part of neuroscience, and what we know about the brain now is that the brain is very much a predictive machine. So I'm going to give you a very easy and classic example to illustrate this point of what predictive processing is. So imagine you're watching a dot moving in a circle, and it's moving in a circle, and you're watching it for about a minute. So your brain has now learned that there's no reason for that dot to not continue going in a circle. Your brain expects it to continue going in a circle. And in this experiment, researchers measured their eye movements to see exactly what they were looking at. And they also asked them to subjectively report where they perceive the dot to be. And what they found is that people tend to see the dot about a milliliter ahead of where it actually is. This means that the dot was, say for example here, but people saw it as being here. This is a classic experiment to illustrate how the way that you perceive the world is literally shaped by how your brain expects to perceive it. And this is not true just for visual stuff. This is also true for auditory stuff. This is true for tactile stuff. This is true for your interactions with people, for your behavior, for your belief formation. This is true for your whole experience and interaction with the world. This is called predictive processing. Predictive processing is not something that is unique to humans. It is something that exists in many animals and many organisms and many cells. It is a fundamental process which has to do with energy preservation. The reason for that is quite simple. It is easier to spend less energy on predicting something and expecting what's going to happen than it is to perceive every single stimuli separately and analyze every single stimulus separately. It is easier to anticipate what's going to happen so you can adapt your behavior to it and you're going to react quicker. And in the wild, obviously, that can be the difference between life or death. For example, if someone is about to swing at you, it's better for you to assume the fist is going to hit you and for you to move than it is to wait and experience the stimulus. So on a very basic level, predictive processing is to do with motor stuff, like the example I just gave you. And as I said, this doesn't just affect motor stuff, this also affects your perception, but it goes all the way to affecting your behavior and your beliefs. This is actually why perception has been dubbed a controlled hallucination. The way that you experience the world is not how the world is, it's how your brain expects it to be. This is also known as top-down processing, which you might have heard of. as opposed to bottom-up processing. Behavioralists, if any of you know, believe that human experience, human beliefs in human behavior, every single one of your thoughts and actions can be explained directly by stimuli and reactions. They believe that our brains just received stimuli and adapted to them, and everything that we experience and are is a direct result of the stimuli from our environment. However, the modern view, and might I say the correct view, is that of top-down processing, which means that we don't quite experience stimuli as they are. They come, our brains analyze them, they put them against our prior knowledge, our expectations, our knowledge about this context, our knowledge about the world, our social expectations, our motor expectations, every single expectation within that context. And only then do we perceive it. We don't perceive stimuli as they are. Our brain analyzes them subconsciously, and only then allows us to perceive them and experience them. So it's a type of loop. There is a stimulus, there is an analysis of the stimulus, and there is a reaction. And every time the brain makes a prediction and then experiences the stimulus, it compares what the difference was between what you expected to perceive and what you actually experienced. And then it updates its database, so next time it happens, it can make an even better prediction. So as follows from this, you can see how what you believe consciously, but also what your brain expects or believes, in other words, subconsciously, can very much directly influence not just what you believe, but literally what you feel and what you experience. A very good example of this is something that all of you have heard, which is the placebo effect. The placebo effect, very simply put, is when you expect something to work, and even though it doesn't physically work, for example, a medicine, you actually experience the effect of it just because your brain expects you to experience the effects of it. And the placebo effect is something that has existed and scientists and doctors have known for a while, and is also why every single good study is a randomized controlled study with a placebo. And because the placebo effect is so powerful, not only are the participants blind to whether they're taking a placebo or an actual medicine, but the actual researchers are blind as well, because if they knew, that could influence their analysis and perception of the results as well. So the participants and the researchers both don't know what the pill is and what the placebo is. This is how powerful the placebo is. This is how powerful expectation is, neuronal expectation is. Another really interesting aspect of this are symptoms which are nowadays, actually quite recently, began to have been called functional symptoms. So functional symptoms are symptoms which don't have a physiological explanation. So for example, your leg is paralyzed. You go to the doctor, however, he sees no problem in your nervous system. He says, no, your leg is fine. You shouldn't experience it. You're imagining it. But the person is experiencing it. They can actually feel their leg being paralyzed. And they say, no, I am not imagining it. It is paralyzed. And a lot of doctors would just dismiss these kinds of people because, like, well, I've tested you. I've done all the neurological tests on you. You should be okay. And if you're still experiencing this, well, you should get some psychological help. And these are not things like paralysis. It's also pain. It's also some headaches. People experience full-blown seizures. People experience half their bodies being paralyzed. And they're just being told, well, no, you shouldn't be experiencing this, just go seek psychological help. But no, they are literally feeling those symptoms. They're not making them up. They're not lying. They're definitely not lying. And there's been a lot of research that proves that they're not lying. This is something that, to this day, not a lot of people and not a lot of doctors around the world are even aware of. They're still dismissing it. And the UK is actually a leader in recognizing this and in trying to treat it and trying to understand it. And the understanding of it is largely on a very neuroscientific level, of predictive processing, exactly. In the past, symptoms like these would have been dubbed women's problems, for example. This will be a symptom for which some woman in the past might have had her womb cut off as a way to treat it, because it's a women's problem. Cases like these could have been dubbed hysteria, or even further back in the day, they could have been called demon possessions. Now we know that this is not true, and we know the reason it is not true. What's really interesting to me personally, because I have an interest in religion, I'm not a big fan of it, but I am interested, and why people believe what they believe. What's really interesting to me is how people treated that back in the day and why it could have looked as if it works. For example, imagine someone is having a functional seizure, which means that it is not caused by epileptic activity, electrical epileptic activity in the brain, but it's still caused by the brain. And to an uneducated eye, it can actually look like a seizure. So in a community that's highly religious, you might treat this with exorcism. And this actually worked. Why did it work? It doesn't work because there's a literal demon in that body that the priest was exorcising by saying a few Latin words over it and sprinkling it with water. It worked because it worked on the exact same neuronal level where the neurological, neuroscientific problem was caused, meaning that there's a loop between that expectation and that stimulus that has been broken and feeds into itself and feeds into the symptom. And when we treat the symptom on that same neuronal level, within that same expectational loop, we can actually change the loop with, for example, an exorcism. Which is why it might have been very convincing to these people. It would have looked as if their point was proven. There was a demon inside their body, we exorcised it, and now the problem is gone. The person says they feel better. They obviously, looking at them, they feel better. They have no symptoms. That's the reason we exorcise the demon. This is the same reason why hypnosis might have worked, why hypnosis to this day still might work on some people and some functional symptoms, because it works within that same neurological loop which causes the symptom. So to go back to the law of attraction, what you expect consciously or unconsciously, or you repeat it so many times consciously in hopes that it will make its way to your unconsciousness, can literally shape what you experience, thus making it more likely that you experience, at least perceptually, what you want to experience. Similarly, to go back to religion, do you know the phrase, seek and you shall find? Well, that is very much true. That is psychologically true, and that is neuroscientifically true. Not because there is something for you to find, but because your brain wants to find it. In other words, within the law of attraction, your brain isn't just hoping that something happens. It actively shapes its experience to make that happen. Now, this was purely talking about the perceptual side of it. However, there is also a behavioral part of it. So obviously what you believe consciously and subconsciously actively shapes your behavior as well. And I'm mostly going to focus on the unconscious here. The difference between someone who just hopes they get something and someone who actively, passionately, wholeheartedly believes they're going to get something might actually be their unconsciousness affecting their behavior in a way that makes it more likely. In a way that your behavior shapes your environment to be in a situation where getting this thing is actually more likely, in comparison to someone who just hoped they get something. And the third way in which the law of attraction could work is the more psychological one, which is confirmation bias and cherry picking. These are, again, very much a result of top-down processing and predictive processing, which we've already discussed. Again, the reason confirmation bias works is because we want to preserve our energy. We want to limit the amount of new stimuli that we need to analyze, which means that if there is any new information which is contradictory to what we already believe, we are more likely to ignore it and go over it, because processing it costs more energy. Whereas if we just find a way to fit it into our existing model of the world, into our bias, if you will, we preserve energy. Cherry picking is the exact same thing. We preserve energy and we also feed back into that predictive processing loop, because the brain sees the parts that it likes and that fit into the model that it expects to perceive, and that actually strengthens the model itself. And the more it's strengthened, the more it perceives of it, the more it's strengthened, and so on and so on. It's a cycle. So in that sense, even without the two previous steps that we experienced, if you wholeheartedly, again, consciously or unconsciously believe something, then you are more likely to find, neurologically, you're more likely to find it in your day-to-day life. For example, if you believe that the world is a horrible and dark and miserable place, you're more likely to go out on the street and see only the faces which are angry or depressed or sad. Whereas if you believe that the world is a happy and positive place, you're much more likely to go out on the street street and see all the happy faces and want to interact with them and see the sun and enjoy how it's glistening and see the birds and find the positivism in all of that. So let's just again look at the example of with a person who just hopes they get something versus a person who really believes they're going to get something. Even if neither of them actually gets the thing, so they both experience the exact same result, the person who wholeheartedly believes they're going to get it is actually going to experience their environment as if it led them closer to their goal. Even if their environment is exactly the same, the person who believes it subconsciously is going to experience it more likely this way. So you can see how this point is quite similar to point 1. However, they're not exactly the same because point number 3 is more of a psychological experience. It still works in the same loop, in the same predictive processing system. However, this is more about your belief formation, whereas point number 1 was more about literal physical perception. So they're just two sides, different sides of the same coin. One is more about belief formation based on confirmation bias. The other one is about literally perceiving the world as you want to perceive it. They're similar, but they're just two different sides of the same coin. So bringing all these 3 points together, if you have two people, one just hopes that they get something, they would like it, they hope for it. The other wholeheartedly believes they're gonna get it. So even if nothing changes, even if their environment is the same, the person who believes it is more likely to shape their belief formation as if what they want is happening. But beyond that, it's actually more likely that they are going to be a bit closer to their goal. And that happens not just because of confirmation bias, it's because they literally can physically perceive what they want to perceive, and also because subconsciously their behavior is going to be aimed at shaping their environment into making it more likely that this thing happens. So, in conclusion, the law of attraction is not a literal thing. It's not just thinking something and it becoming true out of thin air. But there is a grain of truth, a grain of neuroscientific truth to it, as there is in a lot of claims, as there is in a lot of religions, I would say as well. And the phrase, seek and you shall find. Yes, not because there is something to find, but because your brain wants to find it. What you believe literally affects how you perceive the world and how you experience the world. Our brains are extremely powerful prediction processing machines, and they will bend your reality, not physical reality, but your own perception of reality to your liking or to its own subconscious liking. The power of attraction is real, but not because the universe rearranges itself to your liking, but because you do. Your brain does. Your brain reorganizes its model of the universe to fit what you believe. And this model is going to affect how you think, how you see color, what you hear, what you experience, what you believe, and how you see the universe itself. So, manifested into existence, that's not just a metaphor. That is what your brain does. But the existence is not necessarily real existence, but it is the existence between your two ears.